This time on combat ships, the shadowy world of naval deception revealed.
Hitler had put a $250,000 prize for the U-boat captain who could sink one of the Queens. She was a marked ship.
Vessels that were not what they seemed.
It was arguably a greater engineering feat trying to get the submarine than the moon landing.
And crews on cloak and dagger missions.
Minutes after they gave up the search, they had a sonar contact, and then everything started to change.
Extraordinary tales of secrets and lies on the high seas. Combat ships. Fast. Effective.
The mission is pure James Bond espionage.
Deadly.
Japan is willing to throw the dice to engage just about every aspect of their military force in a climactic, decisive battle to stop the United States.
They have changed the world.
Warships have been key factors in global history, from the beginning of civilization to the present day.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews. On April 9th, 1944, German sub U-515 was on fire in the middle of the Atlantic. U.S. destroyers had hounded it to the surface, so their aircraft could finish it off. 43-year-old Captain Dan Gallery watched from the carrier USS Guadalcanal. The Germans abandoned ship. But U-515 stayed on the surface for a few minutes before it sank. It gave Gallery an idea.
Gallery noted that this highly seasoned U-boat crew, under a highly decorated U-boat captain, immediately got off the boat, and they didn't scuttle the boat properly.
They had abandoned ship too soon. Could he scare another crew into doing the same?
And so he thought, what if we were able to capture the ship instead of watching it slowly sink? So at that point, he began hatching a plan to do something no one had done before.
Gallery knew that a U-boat was a treasure trove of intel, from weapons to Enigma codes. He asked the Navy Department in Washington for help.
Can you give me some information that would enable me to capture a German submarine? And if possible, can you give me a ripe one? That's Dan Gallery's word. Can you give me a ripe one for capture?
The Navy already had its eye on a sub, U-boat U-505. Intercepted messages from U-505 in the Atlantic suggested it was a troubled ship. Its skipper, Petr Cech, had committed suicide while on active duty. The crew's morale was low. Its new skipper, Harold Lahn, decided to head back to base.
So the U-505 had been out to sea for a long period of time. They were running low on food, they were running low on fuel. So they start the return cruise home.
Dan Gallery and his anti-submarine unit, consisting of the carrier Guadalcanal and a fleet of destroyers, headed to intercept and capture U-505 off the coast of West Africa. By June 4th, they had almost given up.
And minutes after they gave up the search, they had a sonar contact, and then everything started to change.
Fighters from the Guadalcanal saw the dark shadow of U-505 just under the water. They fired their machine guns to show the destroyer, USS Chatelaine, where to drop its depth charges. Dan Gallery wrote,
U-505 heaved itself up from the depths and broke surface 700 yards from the chatelaine. Our quarry was at bay. I broadcast to the task group. I want to capture that bastard if possible.
An American sailor's camera captured the battle.
Dan Gallery had trained his task group to use sufficient fire to impel the enemy to get off the boat as quickly as possible. Hearing the sound of ordnance ricocheting off the exterior of your boat is going to make you want to get off the boat.
Then, there was an historic moment.
Once the sub had surfaced, the commander of the task force radioed to the ships, away all boarding parties, away all boarding parties. The U.S. Navy was going to capture an enemy ship.
A boarding party from the destroyer USS Pillsbury took to the water. It was a dangerous moment.
So when they hit the submarine, they were expecting to have shots fired in return.
But U-505 was deserted. The crew had abandoned ship in inflatable rafts. Like the crew of U-515 2 months before, they had failed to carry out proper scuttling procedures, just as Dan Gallery had hoped. An intact U-boat was in American hands, and still is today, at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. As the boarding party scoured U-505 for logbooks, Enigma machines, and other intel, American sailors captured the sub's crew. But the sea swell made the abandoned sub dangerous. As the Pillsbury tried to tow U-505, the sub's bow plane gashed a large hole in the destroyer's hull. Pillsbury cut the lines, only just afloat. Dan Gallery's carrier Guadalcanal took over. The Americans interrogated the U-boat's exhausted crew.
A German submarine sailor is a highly trained, highly knowledgeable target for interrogation. And some of the best intelligence that was gathered from a human intelligence standpoint was from interviewing German sailors. And U-505 crew sang like canaries, many of them.
Most useful were the sub's tech secrets. German acoustic torpedoes, which used sound to track their targets, were devastatingly effective in the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied ships had been using noise-making decoys to try and fool the torpedoes, with mixed results.
They were effective but not completely foolproof, and getting the newer acoustic torpedoes and being able to see the technology enabled the Allies to better their decoy technology, and so just make the German torpedoes that much less effective.
The capture of U-505 led to vital torpedo countermeasures. Many Allied lives were saved.
The U-505 is also a monument to the bravery of all the sailors that served in the Navy, but also in particular Dan Gallery's crew. They, against all odds, knowing what was at stake, really risked their lives to try and capture a submarine that they knew would help win the war.
You don't always need a trained Navy to make history. Sometimes, all it takes is a stash of rifles, a wooden yacht, and nerves of steel. July 1914. Ireland was on the brink of civil war. The mainly Protestant northern province of Ulster believed it was about to be betrayed.
The British Parliament was on the verge of agreeing that the island of Ireland could be self-governing in much the same way as a state within the United States is self-governing.
This policy of self-government was known as Home Rule.
In Ulster, the fear was that if a very Catholic majority were in charge of the day-to-day business of life in Ireland, Protestants would be dominated by a very Catholic, conservative culture.
A militia known as the Ulster Volunteers was prepared to fight Home Rule. They armed themselves with 20,000 rifles. To counter the threat from Ulster, Home Rule supporters in the south founded their own militia, the Irish Volunteers. But weapons were scarce. Some marched with wooden rifles. What the Irish Volunteers did have were friends in high places. Pro-Home Rule Anglo-Irish aristocrats and politicians raised money to buy them guns. One, 34-year-old Mary Spring Rice, devised a plan to smuggle the guns into Ireland.
She was a very good strategic thinker, probably we'd call her now. She was able to see that any other form of movement of guns would be difficult, indeed almost impossible, and that the notion of a private yacht rather than any other sort of boat would most likely escape detection.
Another leading figure supporting the volunteers was 44-year-old Englishman Erskine Childers, the author of The Riddle of the Sands, the world's first spy novel.
In his novel, two Englishmen taking a vacation yachting off the coast of northern Germany discover a German plan to mount a secret invasion of Britain. Childers became a hero, if you like, to those who felt that Britain inevitably was soon going to have to fight Germany.
Which, of course, in 1914, it was. Childers owned a yacht that was perfect for the gun-running adventure. Its name was Asgard. In the spring of 1914, Erskine Childers bought 1,500 rifles and 49,000 rounds of ammunition from a German arms dealer sympathetic to his cause. Childers arranged for a tug to take them to rendezvous with Asgard in the English Channel. Asgard sailed on July 3rd. Her crew included Childers and his wife Molly and Mary Spring Rice. They rendezvoused with the tug. Mary wrote in her diary,
"The tug looked black and huge alongside us. Her deck was full of German sailors who jabbered away and looked curiously at us."
Now, these guns in those days would have been very heavy, quite cold, quite unpleasant, quite easy to damage yourself on, and it was all done in a hurry. So there was a lot of sweat and tears and probably blood as well in the unloading. It was a rushed job, but they did manage to get them all in.
Although the Asgard's crew weren't professional gun runners, they chose their weapons well. They purchased 1,500 Mauser rifles.
Everyone unilaterally agrees it is a superb bolt-action rifle.
The gun, developed by German manufacturer Peter Mauser, was successful for two key reasons.
The first was a more efficient bolt locking system, so that there was a better seal between the cartridge and the bolt of the gun to increase the pressure of the gases. So it's got more velocity, which means it can shoot a lot further and a lot more accurately.
The second was a simple reloading system, where 5 rounds could be held in the body of the rifle.
To load the weapon, first we pull the bolt back, exposing the magazine ramp there. We load 5 rounds in one clip. We don't load the rounds individually. We push the rounds into the internal magazine And now the weapon can be cocked, and it's now ready to fire.
Then on July 17th, in an echo of Childers' spy novel, the gunrunners sailed into the middle of a Royal Navy fleet, preparing for war with Germany. Mary Spring Rice wrote in her diary,
"There was one awful moment when a destroyer came very near. I stood holding up the stern light on the starboard side, watching her getting nearer and nearer with my heart in my mouth. Then mercifully, at the last moment, she changed her course and passed us by."
There are photographs of them on the boat where they are holding the guns and they're sitting on the ammunition boxes. I guess the British Navy did have other things on its mind, which is why it possibly went undetected.
After 23 days at sea, Asgard reached its destination, the port of Howth, just north of Dublin. A large force of Irish volunteers was waiting for them.
At first, there was a fearful scramble among the men on shore for the rifles as they were handed up. Then Erskine stopped the delivery until he got hold of someone in command, and some sort of order was restored.
Erskine and Molly Childers then quickly set sail for home. Mary Spring Rice stayed put. She knew that no one would suspect her of being a gun smuggler.
Mary straightens herself down, straightens her hat, and marches off to a hotel in Howth and has a cup of tea.
The authorities, who still answered to the British government, soon heard about the gun smuggling. The Crown may have endorsed Home Rule, but arming a private militia was illegal. A unit of British soldiers tried to break up the volunteers and seize the guns. A crowd gathered to mock them.
They're jeered and attacked, and stones are thrown at them by a crowd of onlookers, not of volunteers, quite tough characters, I would say. And an inexperienced officer gives the order to fire. Three civilians are killed.
A week after the Asgard landed at Howth, the First World War broke out. Most of the Irish volunteers joined the British Army to show they were loyal citizens of the King, and so deserved Home Rule. But some hardliners wanted more, a fully independent Irish republic. They kept their smuggled Mausers hidden, and 2 years later staged a rebellion known as the Easter Rising.
During the 1916 Rising, a lot of these weapons, what were known as Howth rifles, were used by the rebels. And they were actually effective, particularly for long-range fighting.
Both Mary Spring Rice and Erskine Childers supported the rebellion. In 1922, during the bloody civil war between Irish nationalists that followed the signing of a treaty with the British, Childers sided with those who felt Ireland remained too tied to Britain. In November 1922, he was captured and executed. The Asgard is now in the National Museum of Ireland, a private yacht turned combat ship, and a reminder of a key moment in Irish history. 1 year later, another gun-running vessel set sail. It would meet a tragic and infamous end. In the years before the First World War, the most glamorous way to travel was by ocean liner. Few passengers realized that the vessels had another role, as combat ships. When war broke out, the British reinforced the liner's decks and put guns on them. Vessels like the Titanic's sister ship Olympic became troop carriers. Others hauled ammunition from American factories to the Western Front.
These liners were secretly used to bring over arms and explosives. This was kept very secret at the time.
One ship in particular was an effective gun runner. The pride of the Cunard fleet, Lusitania. In March 1915, the Germans suspected the Lusitania was gun running between New York and England. Their spies hung around New York's wharves.
Because America was neutral, the Germans could run an extensive spying operation if they so wished. And many of the American citizens were of German descent, and some of their sympathies lay with Germany, not Britain.
On May 1st, 1915, newsreels filmed the Lusitania as it departed for Liverpool. Over 1,200 passengers were on board, including 189 Americans. Below decks in a secret compartment were 750 tons of ammunition. The greatest threat to the Lusitania was from below the waves. A week before she sailed, Germany had warned that British vessels were liable to destruction, and passengers traveled at their own risk. Only 2 of Lusitania's passengers canceled their trip. Most believed the liner's speed kept her safe from U-boat attack.
Submarines are very, very slow underwater. And even above water, they can only go like 15, 16, 17 knots maximum. So if you have a steamship going 25 knots, monster liner, submarine can never catch up with it.
On May 7th, the Lusitania was off the coast of Ireland, only 15 hours from the safety of Liverpool. Then at 1:20 p.m., Walter Schweiger spotted her. He couldn't believe his luck. Lusitania had slowed to about 18 knots, making her a tempting target.
The U-boat fires a torpedo that hits the liner. Then there is an important secondary explosion.
It blew a massive hole in the side of the ship, and very rapidly, the ship sank.
"1,198 people lost their lives, including 128 American citizens. One of Lusitania's propellers was salvaged in the 1980s. Today, it stands as a memorial at the Liverpool docks.
The Lusitania was important in history because it galvanized the American public in terms of being, in their view at least, a war crime. Women and children going down with the ship, almost within sight of the Irish mainland. Later on, of course, the Germans argued, justifiably so, that the Lusitania was in fact carrying munitions of war. But it didn't really overcome the outrage in America that the Germans were sinking passenger ships deliberately.
Hostility to Germany continued to build until the United States finally entered the war in April 1917. In the Second World War, great liners once again played a life-and-death cat-and-mouse game with U-boats. The most famous of all was the Queen Mary. At the outbreak of war, the British were unsure how to use this fast, iconic vessel.
They really didn't know
what they were going to do. There was talk about, let's cut her down and make her an aircraft carrier. I've seen the drawings for that. There was talk about, do we really need a big ocean liner right now? We could make tanks out of all that steel. And finally, they came down to the realization that during World War I, the British liners served so well as troop ships and really made a difference in getting what they needed from their allies on site, they would go ahead and do that.
Queen Mary was transformed. 6 miles of carpet removed, precious woodwork covered up. Her sun deck fitted out with the latest anti-aircraft guns. Her hull, superstructure, and funnels repainted, earning the Queen Mary the nickname, the Gray Ghost. In 1940, she began work as a troop carrier. The Queen Mary and her sister ship, Queen Elizabeth, were now combat ships and serious targets for German U-boats.
Hitler had put a $250,000 prize for the U-boat captain who could sink one of the Queens. She was a marked ship. She could carry over 15,000 people on one trip, which is not bad for ship design for passenger capacity of about 2,600.
This ship still holds the world's record for carrying more human beings on an ocean voyage. In July of 1943, this vessel left New York, bound for the Clyde in Scotland, with 16,683 souls on board.
The Allies knew the Queen Mary was a big target, but cracked German Enigma codes helped her stay one step ahead of the U-boats. Her rudder was as heavy as the Mayflower and gave the liner the ability to take swift, evasive action.
It was not unusual for the master of the Queen Mary to receive a message in the middle of the night saying that a wolf pack was lying in their track, and the Queen Mary would turn about on her heels, and everyone in the ship would feel the ship list over significantly as she would race away from danger.
By the end of the war, the Queen Mary had carried almost 1 million troops. For 4 years, the Gray Ghost had speed and Lady Luck on her side.
There was a time many years ago when I was a tour guide here in the 70s, one of the young ladies was standing up on the bridge, and there was this one elderly gentleman with a very stern face standing in the back. Finally, after the 3rd presentation, he comes up to her, and in a very thick German accent, he says, "You know, I missed her by this much once."
In the Second World War, defeating the U-boats took more than luck, seamanship, and speed. It took teenagers playing games. January 1942. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Navy had no strategy to deal with U-boat wolf packs that were devastating vital convoys from America. Prime Minister Winston Churchill summoned a former naval commander named Gilbert Roberts to London. He was a skilled tactician who specialized in war games that rehearsed combat situations.
When Roberts arrives at the Admiralty, he's told the severity of the situation. And Churchill's aide says to him, "We want you to get to work on the U-boat problem, using your war games, using your tactical nous. We want you to essentially reverse engineer these Wolfpack attacks to expose where our fundamental misunderstanding is occurring, and then from there to develop and teach these countermeasures that will enable us to fend off the Wolfpack attacks."
That evening, Roberts traveled to Liverpool, to Derby House, the base for a top-secret organization known as Western Approaches Command, now a museum. The desperate fight against the U-boats was orchestrated here.
This main room is like a global gathering of information. Effectively, intelligence came in by radio, by Morse. So all that information was brought in, digested, if you like, by the staff working here, and decisions were made, and information was sent out based upon top command decisions being made in this room.
Gilbert Roberts received a frosty welcome.
When he meets Sir Percy Noble, who is the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches at that time, Noble says to him, well, you know, you can sort of carry on with your games on the top floor, but don't bother me with it. And when you come up with something, perhaps I'll send a few officers to go and be trained by you.
Noble gave Roberts 10 assistants. They were from the women's branch of the Royal Navy, known as Wrens. Some were as young as 17.
To keep the operational navy at sea, you need a huge support structure on land. So free a man for the fleet was very much sort of one of the recruitment slogans that was put out there. I think many were motivated as well by the sense of wanting to do something for the war effort. They might have brothers, boyfriends who were being called up, and they felt they had to do something too.
Roberts and the newly christened Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, marked out their war game on the top floor of Derby House. On one side were the Royal Navy captains, on the other, U-boat commanders. They stood behind high canvas sheets with peepholes that allowed the players to see an equivalent of 5 miles on the board, just like visibility at sea.
In the game, the team who are playing as the Royal Naval ships, really their job is exactly the same as in live action. Their job is to protect the convoy, the flock of sheep as it goes through, to make sure that none of the ships are sunk, or if any of them are, that the U-boat is quickly dispatched with. And for the players who assume the role of the U-boat captains, their job is to try to sink as many ships as possible, and then hopefully to try and exit the battlefield without being caught.
Every 2 minutes, players gave orders to move their ships or subs.
Effectively, it is a game of chess spread out across the floor, but passed on through the Wrens, who become the runners of the game to keep it moving, the game's masters, if you like.
At the end of the game, which would last typically between an hour and a half, everyone comes together, and Roberts, using a 10-foot pole, would sort of commentate on what had happened during the battle.
One of Watu's first tasks was to see if a Royal Navy officer had already discovered a tactic to defeat the U-boats. His name was Johnny Walker, and he'd sunk 3 enemy subs just weeks before.
So successful had he been in that battle that he'd gone home and had written up what he believed to be very effective tactical instructions that he wanted to be sent across to the Navy to say, if you find yourself in a battle with U-boats, this is what you need to do.
But the Navy's top brass was skeptical. Had Walker found the answer, or just got lucky? Walker's strategy, nicknamed Buttercup, instructed escort ships to turn outward from the convoy and let off flares to illuminate any U-boats lurking outside their perimeter. The Wrens and Roberts set about testing Walker's tactic, restaging his battle on the floor. It became clear that Walker's success was down to 3 things: teamwork, an unusually large number of escort ships to hound the U-boats, and luck. Buttercup was not an effective tactic, but the war game did teach something shocking. U-boats weren't firing from outside the convoys, as had been thought for the last 2 years, but inside, on the surface, at point-blank range, from behind. Once the torpedoes had done their damage, the Germans submerged. Roberts wrote,
"So we plotted that out and went through it again and again for 2 days, and I couldn't pick a hole in it anywhere."
Armed with this knowledge, the Watu team developed a tactic to deal with U-boats inside the convoys. Gene Laidlaw, the 21-year-old Wren who had done most of the calculations, christened it Operation Raspberry. The only aspect of Buttercup they copied was ships working as a team.
If the U-boat is below us, what are we all going to do? Well, instead of all splaying out and going off on our own and dropping our depth charges, we're going to move in triangular sweeping patterns right above where we sit, and this way we'll flush them out.
A ship using sonar equipment would come through the back of the convoy, listening for any U-boats.
When they replay the battle again using this tactic, they find that every time they're able to sink the U-boats they're attacking.
A skeptical Percy Noble, head of Western approaches, came to watch the Raspberry tactic play out.
And at the end of the demonstration, Noble stands to his feet and essentially applauds Roberts. He asks for a message to be taken down immediately and sent to Churchill, saying, "We've discovered a cardinal error in our understanding of U-boat tactics."
Roberts wrote,
"For many days, Buttercup was shown with its fallacy, and then Raspberry was shown to visitors. It made me rather unpopular with Captain Walker."
Watu was transformed into a training unit. More than 5,000 American, Canadian, and British officers, including Prince Philip, played their war games. Watu's pupils learned their lessons well. The Battle of the Atlantic began to turn.
So the number of U-boat kills begins to steadily increase throughout the remainder of 1942 from the summer onwards. And in fact, by the summer of 1943, the last of the U-boats is driven from the Atlantic, during which numerous Watu developed countermeasures are deployed by the Royal Naval ships.
Sometimes war games aren't enough to defeat the enemy. Sometimes it takes millions of dollars and the biggest con in history. On February 25, 1968, Soviet combat sub K-129 left her home base of Petropavlovsk on a routine patrol of the U.S. West Coast. She traveled in silent mode for 2 weeks, then disappeared.
What seems to have happened is that there was an accident during some sort of exercise. Most likely, she was surfacing or getting near the surface to go through some kind of missile test exercise. She sinks to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, over 16,000 feet down.
The Soviets had no idea where K-129 and her crew were, but the U.S. Navy did.
The Americans were very interested in what happened to K-129, firstly because where it was, and they had a pretty good idea where it was from their underwater acoustic sensors. It was a good opportunity to trawl up nuclear secrets, intelligence secrets, and also they may have had an inkling that something funny had been going on, and they wanted to find out precisely what had been.
The Americans decided that if they could find K-129, it would be the intelligence coup of the century.
But how could they retrieve the secrets of K-129? 16,000 feet down.
So you're talking about finding a way to recover an object that weighs 2 million pounds, that's at the bottom of the ocean. It was, arguably a greater engineering feat trying to get the submarine than the moon landing.
The CIA got the job. They gave the operation a random code name, Project Azorian. The CIA realized they would need expertise of a company used to deep-sea drilling. The world leader was Global Marine. The company drew up plans for a remarkable ship named the Glomar Explorer. In theory, it would be able to lift K-129 from the ocean floor and bring it to the U.S. undetected. But such a large project needed a cover story. The world was told that the vessel would search for deep-sea minerals, and that its owner was one of the richest men in the world, Howard Hughes.
If you're trying to come up with somebody who would build a really expensive ship to do a speculative venture of mining the bottom of the ocean, Howard Hughes was perfect. He was sort of like the Elon Musk of his day.
Hughes put his name to most of his projects. So when the Hughes Glomar Explorer was revealed after 2 years' construction, it sounded like just one more of the millionaire's bold ventures. Project Azorian had 4 elements.
The biggest and the most important part, I guess, would be the ship, because without the ship, there's nothing. That was the Hughes Glomar Explorer, which is a gigantic ship about the size of a battleship. Then there is the steel pipe string, which is a 16,000-foot steel cable that's going to hang the grabber, the thing that will pick up the submarine. Then you have the grabber itself, which is a claw. I always explain it like that arcade game where you grab the toy.
The 4th component was this huge submersible barge, named Hughes Mining Barge 1.
The barge served 2 purposes. They built the claw inside of it in secret so that it couldn't be seen from the outside, and then it would deliver the claw to the Glomar Explorer without anyone seeing it. Because that was the piece of the mission that you couldn't explain with the cover story. The scale of this barge will tell you the size of this claw. It's the size of a submarine. Massive, massive size.
This was a remarkable operation. First of all, in the speed with which the ship was built, the secrecy which surrounded it and its mission, and the way in which the whole thing was for a long time covered up.
On June 20th, 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer set out from Long Beach, California for the target site. The crew was optimistic. One CIA officer wrote,
"With this crew and this beautiful ship, no task was too difficult. Mission impossible? Nonsense. Impossible was not in our vocabulary."
After 13 days at sea, the Glomar Explorer reached its destination and took up position over K-129. The Claw, nicknamed Clementine after the song about the miner's daughter, started its descent. Project Azorian was fraught with danger. The sub's 3 warheads had enough nuclear material to create an explosion 50 times greater than Hiroshima. The operation started badly. Clementine's descent was hampered by poor weather and technical glitches. It should have taken 2 days. It took 2 weeks. Finally, on August 4th, its claws grabbed hold of K-129. The sub began to rise. Suddenly, there was a jolt. Something had gone wrong. One of the claws broke. Over half of K-129 crashed back to the ocean floor. Fortunately, the nukes didn't detonate. The claw lifted what was left of the sub up into the belly of the Glomar Explorer. So what did they find in the remains of K-129?
There are secrets involved in this story that the CIA will never share. One of them is exactly what was recovered. What we know we got were nuclear-tipped torpedoes, which were capable of sinking an aircraft carrier or bigger.
At the time, the Americans thought that Soviet subs outclassed their own. K-129 proved that wrong.
It was, I think, a confidence booster for the U.S. They were putting a lot of money into their nuclear program. They're sure cutting corners on average construction of their vessels.
The remains of some of her crew were also inside the sub.
The plan was always to be respectful of the remains, and they knew part of that was the proper burial at sea. It was filmed and given to the Soviets later, where a speech is given in Russian and in English, basically saying, you know, even though our 2 countries are at war, we're all brothers in one sense.
The officers and men of this ill-fated USSR submarine, pendant number 722, whom we honor here today, have reached their journey's end.
Had the multi-million-dollar project Azorian been worth it?
Maybe the most important outcome from an American perspective was what it did to U.S. confidence and Soviet morale. I think it was completely demoralizing to the Russians, made them think that the Americans were truly capable of anything. It was carried out under their noses, and I think politically it's hard to put a value on that, but it was hugely demoralizing to Soviet spirit.
History has shown that to succeed in the shadowy world of naval secrets, you need dedication, ingenuity, daring, and a lot of guts.